It's human nature to want to see what's beyond, to want to go past the horizon and explore what's in front of us, and then some. And it's no secret that these desires and aspirations of people are a great inspiration for many open world games. And with Breath of the Wild, arguably one of the greatest open world experiences yet, there are still boundaries. And when we come across these boundaries, we're either pushed back by a gale or a storm, or they're just a straight up invisible wall that we can't get past. But when we see this, we see valleys and mountains and hills and seas and islands beyond. And we can't help but wonder what's there. We have this strong desire to explore it. And we may not be able to. Even if we are able to get past those invisible walls, those boundaries, we'll probably just plummet to our death. It's all just superficial. That said, I do think that this backdrop in Breath of the Wild is more than just a backdrop. I actually think it's a reference to lands beyond that can be seen in the world of Hyrule, the world of Legend of Zelda, the lore. So first off, we need to go back to the original Legend of Zelda. Breath of the Wild takes many inspirations from the original Legend of Zelda. It's fashioned off of it in so many different ways, including the map. They bear many similarities. Of course, Breath of the Wild has many other inclusions from other Zelda games and neat things altogether, and it has a lot more detail and it's fleshed out. And yeah, there are liberties taken, but you have the woods to the south, the coast to the east, and the mountains to the north. It's definitely very similar. Except, what makes things really interesting is that the map in the original Legend of Zelda is actually in the map for Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. It's there. It's just much smaller and scaled down with less detail, but it's a part of the overarching, giant, larger scale map in Zelda 2. So what I'm getting at here is that what we see beyond the boundaries of Hyrule and Breath of the Wild, well, that is actually a nod towards the much larger world in Zelda 2. And that's pretty exciting, but is there anything more to it than that? See, I think there is. But first off, I want to go back to, well, not even back, just to somewhere else here. I want to talk about lands that have been traversed or gone to in other games. And the one I'm speaking of in particular is the Wind Waker. You see, in the Wind Waker, all of Hyrule is destroyed by the oceans. Everything crashes down, everything is ruined. So Link and Tetra and her band of pirates sail north to find a new land of Hyrule so everyone can live there and migrate north. Well, that's where they go. They do sail north. And that land that they find eventually is found and played in Spirit Tracks. See, what makes things interesting is that there's a lot of speculation that the land in Spirit Tracks is the same land that you can explore in Zelda 2. And while the map may not be exactly the same, it could be similar enough when you consider that they could be in different parallel universes. They may not be in the same time, so there's a lot of different changes that occur. And of course, Nintendo's always going to take liberties with design. But it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. So with that said, what does that mean for Breath of the Wild in the story and the timeline? Well, if there is a grand migration north to these lands, and we do sort of maybe get a nod towards it in what we see in the backdrop for Breath of the Wild, maybe there was a migration back to Breath of the Wild. Now, hold on a second. I know that may seem kind of pulled out of nowhere, like out of left field, and it may seem far-fetched, but I actually do think there's some evidence to support this theory I have, that there is a grand migration back from northern lands. You see, first off, we need to go and look at the Sheikah. Now, people have already noted this many times already, but the Sheikah in Breath of the Wild aren't quite the same compared to Sheikah of the past, their predecessors. They do have the trademark white hair, but they don't have the same red eyes. They don't. And people are starting to think that maybe that these people do not have the same lineage, but are rather just people who have come into this new land of Hyrule and want to cherish the memory and pay homage to this grand history of the Sheikah. It makes sense. It's possible. It certainly fits the bill, and it could hint at a grand migration, maybe, but I understand that's not enough to really think that would suggest that there's this grand migration from northern lands to this very old world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. But there's more evidence. So when you look at the stone monuments in Zora's Domain, they depict many things. One of which they tell us that Zora's Domain in Ocarina of Time was destroyed. And the initial calamity from Calamity Ganon happened much after the events of Ocarina of Time. And later on, the Zora find a new Zora's Domain. A new Zora's Domain that's completely separate and different from the initial Zora's Domain that was destroyed. And even then, it's also explained and described that the Zoras establish a new connection with the King of Hyrule, a new relationship, which suggests that there wasn't any sort of relationship prior to that, at least within recent memory. So if the Zora had no home beforehand, they come to this new land of Zora and they establish a new connection with the King of Hyrule, doesn't that seem to kind of suggest that maybe they also migrated from elsewhere? Where? Well, that remains to be seen, but potentially from the northern lands of Hyrule, or elsewhere. And according to Zelda 2, the world is huge. But there's another piece of evidence here, and it comes from the beginning of Breath of the Wild, on the Great Plateau. We are told that the Great Plateau is essentially the birthplace for Hyrule, and we have the Temple of Time, and we have these ruins. And many have noted that these ruins bear a strong resemblance to what was at one point, potentially, Castletown from Ocarina of Time. So, if that is truly the same Temple of Time, the same Castletown, just in ruins and much older, on the Great Plateau from, Ocarina of Time, then what about the giant Hyrule Castle and what's left of Castletown in the center of Breath of the Wild, in the center of Hyrule? It's completely separate. So, what's going on here? Well, if my theory is right, there was a grand migration, and there was no land there. That Temple of Time is essentially a relic of the past, and when people migrated back, they started a new land of Hyrule, a new kingdom, and so they raised a new castle and a new castle town. That would make sense. But does that really mean that the Wind Waker is a predecessor or a prequel to Breath of the Wild? Potentially. Now I know people are thinking, oh, but the game takes place in obviously either the Downfall timeline or the Child timeline. It can't be in the adult timeline. But consider this. There are other similarities, and I think they're pretty strong. So one of them is the rock salts. Now, myself included, I have made the argument beforehand that the rock salts, they do make a reference to an ancient sea, but that ancient sea could just be the smaller ancient seas that we see in Skyward Sword. However, they're very segmented and only take a small piece of the entire land of Hyrule. Yet in Breath of the Wild, these rock salts can be found everywhere. They are littered all throughout the land of Hyrule in completely different regions at different elevations all over the place. How could they get everywhere like that? Well, it would make sense if it wasn't covered entirely by an ocean, like in the Wind Waker. That would truly fit the bill. But the comparisons and potential suggestions of this game taking place in the same timeline as the Wind Waker don't just stop there. You see, we do have the Rito.
No, you must pardon me.
Right. And there is evidence for the Zora having migrated, not being around the Hyrule previously, which could explain their absence in the Wind Waker. But also, there are Koroks. And you see, the thing is, these Koroks, they live, well, with the Deku Tree, obviously. But this Deku Tree, its location is completely different from the Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time. It just doesn't make sense geographically, like, not at all. However, this Deku Tree is in this small wooded area that is covered by these mountainous walls. And that area looks a lot like, in my opinion, to the island where the Deku Tree is in the Wind Waker. So, there's a lot of different structures here and this evidence of migration. Potentially, Breath of the Wild is taking place many, many years after the events of the Wind Waker. They migrated far north, found a new land, the oceans receded, and they came back. And what did they come back to? They came back to find this ancient evil, the Calamity Ganon. But they felt they needed to come back because they had this desire to pay homage to their history, to live in their homeland. And that could explain why the Sheikah care so much about being Sheikah, even though they're not really Sheikah. It makes sense. I mean, there is all these different references to their history, like even with the stone monument, it's all as told by King Dorephan, as if they're trying to relive and maintain the life and the history for Hyrule. So it's just a theory, everyone, but if you guys think that maybe I could be right, that maybe there's more supporting evidence for this, let me know in the comments below. Or if you disagree, let me know, let's talk about it. I have other theories for the Downfall timeline and the Child timeline as well. I mean, it's hard to say truly, guys, but it's interesting to say the least, and this is just another mystery in Breath of the Wild.